communities are getting much more critical about solar projects, and they are much more asking about their benefit. So what their specific benefit of a solar project could be.
I think there's also a good reason why, for instance, if you look at smart meter deployment in countries like Spain, it is much more advanced compared to countries like Germany. And this is simply because of the affordability of energy and the cost associated with that.
If we look at the current state of the electricity market, we usually tend to look at all the obstacles and all the hurdles we still need to overcome to arrive at a satisfying state. However, imagine you were to be a time traveler from the year 2000 traveling to our present times. You probably were to rub your eyes at how much energy systems and markets have already changed since then. Artificial intelligence is making generation and consumption forecasts ever more accurate. Battery storage systems now cost only a fraction of the price, and dynamic electricity tariffs and variable grid charges are paving the way for more flexible demand. Nevertheless, of course, there is still enough to do on our way to 100% renewable, flexible and affordable electricity supply. With our final episode in 2024, it's time to look at all the way we came and, of course, where we still need to go in order to create a better balance between electricity generation and demand.
Welcome to the Smartery podcast, a podcast for and with the creators of the new energy world. A world in which energy will be renewable, decentralized and digital, bringing together electricity, heat and mobility. Let us show you how we will get there and who will get us there.
For a little trip through time, I'm happy to welcome two guests. On the one hand, Martin Vogt, Chief Project Officer at HEP Solar. He has more than 15 years of experience in the field of renewable energy and currently holds responsibilities for a 6,000 megawatt greenfield solar PV project pipeline. Along with him, Dr. Julian Hochscherf, Head of ESG at HEP Solar for the past 2 years already. He works on all sorts of aspects of sustainability in the sphere of solar PV markets and supply chains, as well as in the field of impact investing. Welcome, Martin.
Hi, Zach. Thanks for having us.
Welcome, Julian.
Thank you for having us. Great to be here. Thank you.
To set the scene for a time-traveling episode, I'd like to start with a quote. It's a rather challenging quote, so pay attention. It's from the economist Severin Bornstein, who said in 2002, "In nearly all electricity markets, demand is difficult to forecast and is almost completely insensitive to price fluctuations, while supply faces binding constraints at peak times and storage is prohibitively costly." Now, Martin, maybe, actually, I'm only around for a couple of years and not all our listeners have been around since 2002. Maybe you can actually put that quote into context, what scene we were looking back then and how it has changed to present times.
So if we look at this very interesting quote, I think we can look at the different aspects of it to give the listeners a bit more context to this. So we look here at electricity markets. If we look at electricity markets, we always have to speak about highly regulated markets. And what has happened in the last 20 years foremost was we have come from a system that is monopolistic, that is centralized, that is nationalistic, fueled by fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, also nuclear, to a market structure and a market regulation that is now we have an integrated European electricity market. We have unbundled markets, so the separation of generation and transmission. And with that, obviously, also come other institutions, like, for instance, the European Electricity Exchange. So for me, the most significant aspects what have changed in the last 20 years is the electricity market structure and design, the evolvement of renewable energies in the market mix, meaning the highly growing number of solar and wind installations, especially here in Europe, but also globally. And obviously the different consumer behavior when it comes to demand.
And one thing that has changed for sure as well is that renewables are not anymore just perceived sustainable because they're renewables, but people now really look into the way they're being produced. They look into the supply chain, which is actually the reason for you, Julian, having the role that you have, ESG, head of ESG, right? So that's probably something that hasn't been a topic 20 years ago?
I mean, when I started at HEP 3 years ago, it was not even then a topic. So a colleague of Martin asked me in the very beginning of whether I would like to join the procurement calls, because no one is talking about sustainability, no one's talking about emissions in the production process. And my experience is that this has partially changed. I mean, still there are some producers in the market or component producers in the market that don't care about it at all. But there are others that are able to provide you with product carbon footprints, that are able to trace their supply chains back to the origin. So there's really a change coming from the regulation side, to my perception, that has helped us in gaining more transparency in our supply chain. Yeah.
Just as a little detailed question here is, you said that you're in a lot of procurement calls. What does an ESG manager at a PV project developer actually do all day long?
So the role at HEP is a bit particular, I would say. I mean, I have lots of colleagues emerging in different types of companies, but you have to understand the business model of HEP, which is like a twofold business model. We have the project development section at the one side, and we have the investment section on the other side, which closely interact with each other. And the money that we raise through our sustainable investment funds needs to be investable into the projects that we develop. So the idea is basically to be the bracket between our investment business and the project development business, and to ensure that the projects keep the promises that we make to investors, and that we make it transparent and traceable, for our investors in the end. Yeah.
Oh, that makes totally sense, because, I mean, specific in Europe here, people always usually focus on CSRD or CSDDD, but there, of course, is a lot of regulations for sustainable investments as well. And I guess a lot of need for transparency. And solar as such is not necessarily sustainable, so you really have to prove the way your supply chains work, your project development, etc.
Definitely. So we're also speaking about CSRD regulation, not CSDDD. So we're too small for CSDDD, but of course we're speaking about the CSRD implementation right now. So that's really like the, you could say, fun story about HEP, that you have the joy of doing both types of regimes of regulation. So the financial market disclosure and taxonomy regulation, and the one coming from the real economy. So most importantly, the CSRD that is coming up here.
Now, specifically everything around sustainability and ESG is a topic that already has effective regulation in place. On the other hand, if we look at the extreme price fluctuations on the electricity exchanges caused either by a big surplus, so speaking about negative pricing, or a shortage of electricity, where are we at there, Martin?
Yeah, that is a massive challenge, obviously, for the energy markets, is the appearance of negative prices caused by a growing number of solar and wind assets that are being connected to the grid. Really only appearing, I would say, in the last 2-3 years. We see a growing number of hours in most of the markets. So what is being considered here, the holy grail in every market, is obviously the battery storage. The battery storage in the future years, and I've looked at the most recent predictions that, let's say, in Europe alone, we will deploy more than 90,000 megawatts of stationary battery storage. They will take the role twofold. On the one hand side, the peak shaving, meaning at the moment we see, especially during maybe some winter days or extreme events, very, very high prices at the EEX, for instance. So what will the batteries do? They will be capacity available, deploying energy into the grid, reducing those peaks to a more reasonable amount. But on the other hand, the same way it also works for the negative pricing that we are currently seeing in the market. We see growing numbers, and I would expect for the next 4 or 5 years to see even more hours per year that have negative pricing. But with the deployment of batteries and better balancing supply and demand, the current predictions say that the latest 2030, 31, we will see declining hours of negative pricing. And then in a decade from now, this occurrence of negative pricing will actually completely disappear again, because then we use the flexibility of the batteries in order to not just shave the high prices, but also shave the very low prices.
Well, this would be a point where it'd be quite interesting to actually travel to 2040 and see if those predictions come true. But we'll probably pick that up then in episode 510 of the Smartery podcast in 2040. Coming back to the here and now, of course, there's a lot of developments happening. Obviously, due to all the sustainability regulation, we will see an electrification of the heating and transport sectors, which, of course, again, will increase the gap between electricity supply and demand on the other hand. So what are the best ways to handle that gap and to balance it out from an economic point of view? Should we more look into storage or should we more look into flexible consumption? What do you think, Julian?
So I think that the challenge that we're seeing right now is that we have to transition from a system where we produced energy according to demand to a system where we consume energy when it's produced. So that's like the change in paradigms that we have here. So I think the most relevant topic really to discuss this is about data. So you have to have a lot of insights into demand structures on regional and local levels, which is, to my understanding, also the reason why we had seen this share deal between RWE and E.ON in the year 2019, where they separated grid operations and production capacities. So because now you have a really concentrated market for grid data on E.ON or in E.ON's hands. So that's to my understanding central, that you have access to the data that you need in order to forecast demands on the regional and local level. Of course, to my understanding, the most reasonable way would be to include the already existing infrastructure that you have. So and the technologies that are deploying more and more, such as electrical vehicles, such as heat pumps. That's the task of our times to include them in a smart way in the infrastructure that is already there. Then it might be possible to delay the grid construction to some extent, although you won't prevent that at all.
All right. So you're saying if we are able to make our grids smarter, faster, we can actually save on additional infrastructure.
That's what I would answer from a sustainable perspective also, to say, well, let's of course also think about of how we can make use of the infrastructure and the technologies that are already deploying. Yes, so that's basically the story. I mean, that's probably not enough, but it's a first step.
That's speaking from a sustainable point of view. Let's look at it from a business point of view, Martin. That's your area.
And I think the big unknown currently is the consumer, because the consumer has to change the behavior in order to fulfill this paradigm shift that Julian was talking about, right? I mean, if you're a business, if you're a commercial or industrial consumer, you can make long-term and medium-term investment decisions in order to follow, a more dynamic pricing model. If you're a if you're a private individual and you are now asked basically by the industry to change your behavior, I think this is really where I'm really curious how this will develop. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of companies out there with smart solutions combining what Julian also already mentioned, things like heat pumps and your car battery and your solar rooftop installation, connecting it all with a smart meter and offering certain dynamic pricing. But ultimately, and I think historically, it has shown to teach consumers a new behavior is something very, very challenging. And I think it will also take time to do so. So if you look at business partners, and we at HEP, we are also involved in the rooftop installations for C&I, not for residential consumers, but for C&I. So we are well aware of the challenges also in the business models that some of our peers have currently when it comes to the deployment of hardware, and then use the data that you are collecting in order to use the energy that has been produced, for instance, at the stock exchanges to trade and to turn it into a sustainable business model.
If we look back at the B2C challenge that you described, Martin, that consumers really have to change their behavior, I just recently read a quite smart statement that said that it's also a psychological problem that with renewables, you usually save a ton of money, but you save it over the course of 10 years. And consumers just want to know, how much am I paying next month? And if your gas boiler promises to save you 10 cents next month, psychologically, you're more eager to buy into that. How can we solve that? Is that a question of business models or?
It is indeed, and I think there are already players in the markets who promote this very smartly in order to engage with the consumer and to foster a change of behavior. And it's in a niche, I think, already happening. It will certainly happening with the most cost-sensitive consumers. I think there's also a good reason why, for instance, if you look at smart meter deployment in countries like Spain, it is much more advanced compared to countries like Germany. And this is simply because of the affordability of energy and the cost associated with that. So I think we are starting with that, but it's a long way to go, and business models need to be proven to be sustainable.
And I just recently came across as an offer for, I think a German electricity provider, one of the new players, and they actually went into their marketing materials with a guaranteed price, working price for power for the next 10 years. So that might have been a way to cover that psychological barrier. But Julian, you wanted to jump in there as well.
I just wanted to add that I'm not looking on this topic from a like philanthropic sustainability perspective to say, well, people have to change their behavior because it will all save us. So that's not the bottom line of what I wanted to say. So the bottom line is, of course, that you have to incentivize customers to change their behavior, and I think that the technology to do that is already there, right? So electrical vehicles and heat pumps and also home storage models is all type of technology that you can also make usable for steering grids in an intelligent way. But I mean, you need smart meters, you need also the willingness of the people to participate. But if you provide them a monetary incentive to charge a battery or the electric vehicle at low prices and put the energy back into the grid at higher prices, they might have an immediate earning potential from that technology. Of course, you have to coordinate that. You need, as I said in the beginning, the data on the demand for these households at a given place. You have to know how much kilometers will this electrical vehicle go by the next day, so that you have a battery charged sufficiently at a sufficient level. But to my understanding, this is all a coordination issue that is solvable. It's not easy to solve, but it's in theory solvable as long as you have high granularity in data on the demand side.
We went into this whole discussion with the question whether it's more about storage or whether more about flexible consumption. Now, if we focus on the storage, Martin, and because we already was going back and forth between private consumers and industry, for whom and when are storage solutions the most relevant?
That's a very valid question. And I think actually there are quite opposite opinions on this. And you see that on the regulation side, because in some markets, the market design has shifted to give the battery storage element to the grid operators, because they say they have the data and they have also the investment incentive to invest in large scale storage. And then there's the opposite way that says, no, storage should be as decentralized as the generation. Again, I think we all understand that we come from a highly centralized generation and grid system, and we go into basically in completely atomic new system where everyone is participating in the generation. They're participating in the storage, whether it's through your storage element in your basement or your car, through your rooftop installation. From my personal point of view, I believe in the decentralized concept because I think it's a mega trend in general to have an economy and a society that is based more on shared infrastructure rather than monopolistic centralized infrastructure. I think we see that on all elements, whether it is computing power for AI or things like storage. So I would continue to encourage consumers as much as grid operators, solar and wind farm operators to include as much storage as their business model or their incentives support to their generation side.
And I guess that's something that we'll probably see play out in different variations in different markets. Just as we saw, different approaches at the electricity grid, I don't know, in Germany versus France, Germany having a whole hundreds of players, France being more centralized. I guess it's going to go the same way with storage, right? Some grids with more grid-side storage and some grids with more consumer-side storage. So curious to follow that development. Now, looking at another lever, Julian, let's talk about variable network charges as one of lever to balance electricity supply and demand more effectively. What role do you think will that play?
So I think the most important starting point is to understand what are network charges aimed for. So why are they being raised? I mean, it's of course in order to maintain the grids that you have there. So you have to build like the substations, the transformers, the transmission lines. So that's all money that all consumers and users of the grid have to pay. But at the same time, we also speak about redispatchment costs and costs in order to substitute energy that you lose because of transportation, because of transmission. So all these are elements that are constituting network charges. Now, what you see in the market is that you feel in particular in grids that this is a system, so the charging solutions or the charging models are from the old world, let's say from the centralized energy infrastructure. So for instance, consumers that have really like even but large amounts of energy consumption, they are mostly exempted from paying grid fees or grid usage fees. So there's a lot of like old world still in the network charging system right now. At the same time, we see that the decentralized energy structure that is coming up there, so in the form of solar and wind parks, they are fitting into the last mile distribution system now, feeding into this type of grids where the costs of building up these grids are increasing, but you cannot hand them over to a higher level of grids. So we have here really like a distribution problem, because the people in the last mile, or the users in the last mile, they have to bear the costs of building the infrastructure. So flexibilizing network charges, so not to incentivize even and stable energy consumption, also to think about how can we distribute the costs across different levels of grid operation that might enable a more efficient allocation also of solar and wind installations, which is in the end just increasing the efficiency of the distribution of energy, bringing closer together producers and consumers of energy.
Now, before we went into the question, I said that, there's different approaches, and we'll probably see it playing out differently in various markets. Now, with you guys being active in various markets, what trends do you see in your daily work to improve the integration of solar energy?
It's indeed something. I mean, we are active spanning from Canada to Japan, and each of these markets are in different stages of, let's say, the energy transition. And it's really, really interesting to see how individual governments force or not force this deployment of energy in the markets. Some markets, like Japan, they have just finished the feed-in tariff system, moving towards, let's say, the more private market model of power purchase agreements, where private market participants are really coming together on bilateral agreements and pricing, which we very much favor compared to very static feed-in tariff systems, because from my personal perspective, solar PV and the levelized cost of energy is at a point where we are absolutely cost competitive. So I don't think that any more state subsidies are really helping the future deployment of solar. On the other side, we would also like to see that there are no barriers being put up for solar. We see, for instance, in the United States, that the whole discussion around domestic content, about tariffs on imported panels, that this really is not just the supporter, but it's also increasing, again, the costs of the solar energy being produced, right? And in between, you have markets like Canada and Germany that maybe take a much more balanced view on this. But overall, and I think this is true for institutional investors, this is true for private consumers, as much as commercial and industrials. At the end, you need to have predictability and certainty of what is going to happen. Because, as you mentioned before, these are investments that need to amortize over a longer period of time, let's say 10 years. So everyone who's involved in the business needs to have some certainty that the business model that you're currently following is also sustainable for the foreseeable future. And this is where we always see the biggest disruption in solar energy integration, when a market is facing uncertainty, when there's a political change, when someone is implementing tariffs or a moratorium or similar things. This is what we really see as the biggest challenge for solar going forward.
Wow. Julian, I know you want to add something there, right?
So I would probably add the perspective of what do we experience in deploying our projects and to bring our projects to markets. Probably 5 or even shorter, 2-3 years ago, it was enough to say, well, let me build a solar park here and you're going to save the world, and tell that to communities, and everyone said or believed in it. Sorry, I mean, it was the spirit of the year 2019, 2020, when the Fridays for Future movement was really strong and visible. So what is being now the shift, and is what I perceive in my daily work, as far as I see it, is that communities are getting much more critical about solar projects, and they are much more asking about their benefit. So what their specific benefit of a solar project could be. So what we do is to discuss much more about community engagement, to see how can we or how can the project fit into the local circumstances. So which production structures do we have there? What business are there? What is the amount of transition and change that we induce because we are now there? And so I had a quite personal experience some months ago when I went through the Neckar Valley close to Heilbronn with my bike, and there are some coal plants there, and I thought, well, it's obvious. So here's the coal plant. On the other side of the street is the village where people lived. Now you're getting there as a solar developer, not necessarily in the Neckar Valley, but there might be examples of this where you to some extent contribute to, well, change, and people lose their habits of living and working at the same place, because no one works in the solar park once it has been constructed. So what we're really facing, or the challenge that I see in the future, is really to think about how can we integrate the projects most reasonably into the local structures, and also to help people transition into what they have and what they bring to the table, and also to cope with the flexibility, the variability that our energy production form brings with it.
Well, I really like both aspects. The one that you really need to tie in communities and how they actually benefit from solar parks in their region. And the other thing that I never thought about is that, of course, if you have a coal plant or something, people in the community used to work there for years or decades. And as you rightly pointed out, you only construct a solar park once, and then maybe you need one guy cleaning it every couple of weeks or something like that. So that's a very different approach for the community. Interesting. Now, we're almost out of time, so let's close this with a look into the future. We started in this comparing, let's say, 2002 to 2024. Let's compare 2024 to 2045. If we go into the future a little bit more than 20 years, how might it look like? What will our energy system look like then, and what will electricity costs be like, Julian?
So maybe I would probably like to conclude as people would expect it from an ESG manager. So I think we have no other choice but to decarbonize. So that's the only way that we have to go. So I recently saw studies saying that we already have locked in 19% of GDP loss until 2050, no matter what our future emissions will look like. So this is what we will lose with certainty. Sorry to say that, but in order to make it not even worse, we really have to decarbonize, and in addition, we have to circularize. So solar PV is really, and also wind and hydro, these are really like the energy sources of the future, to my understanding, because they allow us to become circular in the form that we produce energy. And this is a factor you cannot underestimate or undervalue. So this is a question that I receive from investors and interested people looking at our company, is to say, well, what about the raw materials? Are they being scarce? What happens to solar modules once they are no longer state of the art? And the story behind this is our business model has every ability to become circular. So it's possible from a technological perspective to recycle them, to rebuild them. The technology is already there. We need to scale it up, of course. We need to spread it out to the world, but it's already there, and we can make the business model really circular. So for the business model, I would say there's so much efficiency to earn from technology. So it's so much more efficient to move around in an electrical vehicle compared to a combustion vehicle. So we have to make consumers feel that efficiency gain. I think we discussed some of these attempts right now, and this is really like leading me to the final argument to say that we have to rethink the way we treat energy. So we always speak about rebound effects. So the technology that allows us to become more efficient mostly leads to an increased consumption of that good or of that product. So we have to really think about how we use that energy, which is really precious, to prevent rebounding effects. But with all these measures that we discussed in the last 45 minutes about flexibilization, about making use of electrical vehicles, not just as a mode of transportation, but also as a mode of earning money by using it in a grid-friendly way, I think this is where we are going, or where we are heading for in the next 20 years, hopefully.
And hopefully will not go any further than those 19% GDP loss that you described in the beginning of your statement. That is the goal and the reality we have to face, as we are actually half time on our way to climate goals 2030 and our goals for 2050. I think the coming year, 2025, really is halftime for both of these goals. So thanks a lot for joining me for a trip through the past, the present, and the future too. Thanks a lot, Julian.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for having us.
And thanks a lot, Martin.
Thanks, Zach.
Find out more at the Smarter E Europe, Europe's largest alliance of exhibitions for the energy industry. The Smarter E Europe takes place from May 7th to May 9th in Munich. Spanning 4 exhibitions, the Smarter E Europe brings together relevant players from around the world, showcasing the latest market developments, trends and technologies.